Well, it sort of seems impossible. One spring can make a knife blade go both ways an unlimited number of times. I've seen a bunch of videos on YouTube explaining how Microtech knives work, except they don't really explain how they work. They usually just cover how to take the knife apart fully. But in this video, I'm actually going to reveal the secret about how these knives work. So let me show you. So this guy right here is the secret behind the Microtech knives. This is what I'm going to call the slider. You'll notice a few things about the slider. There's just one main metal piece. It's nearly as long as the blade inside the knife. There's a spring in the middle, and this is an extension spring, meaning that it wants to pull itself together. And on each end there's a little hook, which currently is hooking each end of the spring to each end of the slider. So I'll unhook one of the hooks, and one of them falls off, but you'll see that they are different from each other, and I'll explain that more later. The first big task of the slider is that it extends the spring. So the concept behind this knife essentially is that the slider moves while the blade remains in place. One end of the spring moves with the slider while the other stays affixed to the stationary blade. So if you've ever stretched rubber band between your fingers and let one side go but held onto the other side, the rubber band goes flying towards the fingers that are still holding it. So the same thing is true here. So you extend the spring, then the blade is released, and the end of the blade that is released goes flying towards the other end of the spring that is still attached to the stationary slider. So when the knife is in the closed position, both the blade and the slider are back in their rearmost position. And this slider, as I said, is attached to the activation slider, and they move together all the time. And you'll notice that the blade is not moving underneath the slider. So what happens is you slide the slider forward, because both are, like I said, back when the knife is closed. And as you slide it forward, the spring is being extended because the rear hook is hooked behind the rear of the blade in this little semicircular cutout you see down here. And the front of the spring, the front hook, is hooked around the front of the slider here. So the spring is being pulled apart, and once it reaches a certain point, the locking gate releases the knife, and I'll explain that more in a second. Releases the blade, rather, and the blade is able to come flying forwards out of the knife, where it then locks in front of the front locking gate and is now in the out position. So now, as you notice, the spring is not extended any longer. The blade and slider are both in their forwardmost position. So to close the knife, the process is just reversed. The slider moves back, thus extending the spring again. Now this time, the rear hook is hooked behind this cutout in the slider. The front hook is hooked in front of the stop pin for the blade. And at a certain point, the blade is, the locking gate, this forward one, releases the blade, and the blade comes shooting back again into the knife. And then you must pass the rear locking gate, and under the force of the spring, has no trouble doing that. But with me gingerly moving it, it does have trouble doing that. So now, once again, we are back to where we started, which is the slider and the blade both being in their rearmost positions. So this brings us on to the second main function of the slider, and that is to release the blade at the appropriate point. So as I said earlier, there are two locking gates. There's a front one and a rear one, and they both work the same, just on opposite sides. There's a pivot at the back here, and the front just pivots up, and there's a spring pushing it back down again. The rear one is basically the opposite. There's a pivot at the back, or front rather, and a spring that pushes this end up. And these are what actually locks the blade in the closed position, as you see here, or in the open position once the blade is extended. So when the blade is closed like this, this end, the raised end of the locking gate, rests upon this locking shoulder, which you're seeing a clip of now, which prevents the blade from going forward as the slider and the spring moves forward. When the blade is extended, the rear of the blade, which you should be seeing a clip of now, locks against the dropped down or raised portion, depending on which way you're looking at it, of the front locking gate. So that's what keeps it in place. So in order for the blade to move either out of the knife or back into the knife, or handle rather, the blade must be released at the appropriate time once the spring has been pulled far enough apart that there's enough tension there to send the blade flying whichever direction it's going with the speed and force that is necessary. So what is responsible for that, once again, is the mythical slider. The slider has a camming surface right here. You notice a distinct angled cut. And simply, this camming surface pushes the raised end of the locking gate downwards whenever I move it forwards. And something very similar happens at the front here. There is a hidden camming surface on the back, and that does the exact same thing, while slightly harder to see behind the slider. You should be able to get the impression that it cams that up. So this is similar to the sear and hammer, if you will, in most firearms, where the locking face that I showed you the clips of earlier, either in the front or the back of the blade, are butting up against the locking gate, and the two parts are essentially sliding past each other until there's so little touching between them that the blade slips past and is able to fly either forwards or backwards. So one of the essential aspects of these hooks is their ability to latch either around the end of the slider or a part of the blade. So in the case of the rear hook, it either hooks in the semicircular cutout I pointed out earlier on the back of the blade. When the slider is sitting on there, it will look something like that. At this point, when the blade is in this rear position, the front hook will simply be hooked around the front of the slider, like so. Now, when the blade is extended, the rear hook has stayed behind, hooked onto the end of the slider after slingshotting the blade forward, and along its way, this circular stop pin has grabbed onto that concave surface on the bottom of the front hook, grabbed it and taken it forwards with it. So now this is what it would look like when you go to pull the blade back. Is you see the front hook stays in place with the blade, while the rear one, of course, comes rearwards with the slider. One small detail is the stop pin is what prevents the blade from coming too far out the front of the knife. If I can grab with my fingernails here, you see the hole, and this will allow me to pull the blade all the way out the front of the knife once I remove the stop pin. The stop pin, of course, fits in this hole in the side of the blade, and you'll see on this side there that the stop pin actually protrudes out some, and that protrusion sits down into the groove milled on the bottom of the handle scale, and this is what stops the blade from coming out the front of the knife. This is probably the part of the video where I'm supposed to say something about how you shouldn't open your Microtech knives because it voids warranty when you do. I am still unconvinced that there is a Microtech warranty department at all. I have been completely unable to contact them in any way, shape, or form. This thing broke, that's why I had to open it originally. So I figured, might as well open it, what the hell. So if you learned anything useful from this video, maybe consider subscribing, dropping a like, commenting, etc.